all that, though, there have been renewed calls for the introduction of graduated driving licences. This follows the case, the very recent case of a 19-year-old who was jailed last week for causing the death of 3 teenagers just 6 weeks after passing his driving test.
Our first guest today is helping lead this campaign. Crystal Owen's 17-year-old son, Harvey, tragically lost his life in a car accident alongside his 3 friends while on a camping trip in Snowdonia. Crystal joins us now to share her story. Good morning, Crystal. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm so sorry about your loss. Can you tell us about what happened on that day back in 2023 to Harvey?
Yeah, so a few days before, Harvey told me he was going to go away with some friends that we knew from school. He'd just turned 17 a couple of weeks before, and so immediately I was like, I want to know more.
Yeah.
He showed me a video message which confirmed that he was going to be stopping at a friend's granddad's house, a cottage in Harlech, and so, you know, everything tied up, his story did, and the 2 friends we thought he was going with, you know, we'd known for years. So after work on the Saturday night, he set off with what I thought was one of the parents going to this granddad's house. He texted me when he was there. The next morning, I got a picture from the view from the cottage. So everything tied up. He'd left in like a thin coat, black leather shoes, tiny little rucksack, no sign of a camping trip whatsoever. And then I went about my day after getting this message thinking, oh, he's having a lovely time. I was really happy for him to have his first weekend away with some friends. And my literal words were to my partner, what harm can he come to, you know, tucked up safe at a friend's granddad's, you know. And then my messages didn't go through, like, throughout that day, and I just put it down to Signal. And
because you're trying to text him to make sure he was OK?
Yeah, like later on in the day, and then nothing, and yeah, and then from all of this, it basically ended up with us being frantic with Rory, finding out that they'd left not long after this picture message that I'd received. They'd set off for Snowdonia, which I had no clue about. And then they were missing, basically. And our world, it was just an absolute living nightmare. We were confident that they were going to be found, but we then found out that this young boy that he'd recently met at college, who was a year older, had actually been the one that had drove them there. So I was just in a blind panic, and we went to Snowdonia, and we were just following all these false leads, and then we had the worst news any parent could ever dream of. It was just horrific. So we found out that the driver had lost control on a rural road on a bend, and all 4 boys, they ended up in a water-filled ditch and all lost their lives to drowning.
Can't begin to imagine how you process something like that, Crystal.
I still haven't processed it. It's, yeah.
There's so many elements of this that you will have poured over and gone over with your family to try and understand, starting with why Harvey felt the need to lie to you about the trip in the first place. I
think with Harvey, he was a typical teenager. He knew I wouldn't have allowed him to go camping in winter, so he just twisted the truth. And, you know, it wasn't a terrible lie. They weren't doing anything wrong, you know. He just knew on that occasion I wouldn't have allowed. And he also knew I was a bit of a nervous wreck with him on his push bike, and I was always checking on him. So he also knew I wouldn't have allowed a young driver who I didn't know to be taking him to Wales. But this is just teenage behaviour, you know. He was the most perfect lad you could ever wish to have as a son, you know, and he just did what any teenager, we've all been there, we've all done that, you know, twisted the truth to get our freedom, basically. But sadly, this was to be his, you know, he never got to learn from this mistake, and this was to be his one and only trip away.
And the lad who was driving, it actually, he wasn't overdoing the speed limit or anything, was he? It was an accident, essentially.
Well, only a very tiny percentage of crashes are classed as an accident, so it's around 4%. So the driver is responsible, and yeah, ultimately his driving was what caused the crash. And this is why we're fighting for this law, because, you know, driving on rural roads, which is the most dangerous road you can drive on, you know, young people are 70% more likely to crash on a rural road. You know, this isn't covered in their driving lessons, you know, and it's just comes with experience, you know, so a more experienced driver would know that just because a speed limit is 60, that's not a target, you know, you have to drive to the conditions, if it's been raining, etc. So that's why we're fighting with this. It's not that, you know, we're saying young men are like boy racers, we're saying that it's inexperience.
Yeah. We were talking about it, actually, in the production, weren't we?
Because my Jack is 18 and he's just passed his driving test and loves the freedom that being able to drive a car brings him, loves being able to share those journeys with his friend. Can you explain what a graduated driving licence is then, what the implication of that would mean to Jack and lots of other young people who've just passed their driving test?
Yeah, so it's been in place in many other countries for decades now and has been hugely successful. It's worked in every single country. So what we're asking for, there's many forms of a GDL, but what we're asking for is to focus on the 17 to 19-year-olds, which is the most risky age group, and we're asking for a 6-month learning period. So that could be with a logbook, etc. It doesn't have to be all paid lessons, but they need to gain valuable experience on all...
Because there is that urgency, isn't there, that when you turn 17, you want to punch the test really quickly, so you have to learn for 6 months minimum.
Because if you think, like, somebody could have 5 lessons right now and they would never have drove in the dark, they would never have drove in the wet conditions, so that's all hugely valuable experience. And so we're just asking for 6 months learning period, and then we're asking for 6 months with no peer age passengers unless they are accompanied by an older adult, which means they'll be less likely to crash. And there would be exemptions in place for young parents and certain jobs, etc. And I think the message we need to get out is that, you know, this isn't a case, and I've heard it all, just because your son died, just because your son was an idiot, blah, blah, blah. You know, all these trolls and stuff say all this stuff, but ultimately, this is, you know, I'm not trying to punish young people. This is actually protecting them. You know, my son and his friends never, ever expected to get in that car and not come home. And I think any young person who is against this should speak to Harvey's remaining friend, who lost 3 best friends that day. You know, this is a lifetime thing. It's not, there's no restart button, you know, their lives have ended. And I think with this law as well, it would bring insurance down, you know, because at the moment, people say, you know, you're trying to restrict their freedom when actually many, you know, young people are priced out of driving because they can't afford it because of the insurance premiums. And we know that this law would bring insurance down. So it's making them drive, enabling them to drive, but in a safe way.
We also know that this law does work. It's been implicated in Australia, in New Zealand, and it's actually brought the death rate down by 83%.
That's in Canada, where it's been in place since the 1990s. I mean, this is the thing. In every single country, it's worked between 20 and 40%, depending, because every country has different elements of it. And that's what we can't understand. It's a proven method. The government keeps saying they want to look at root causes. We know the root cause, and that is brain development. So no matter what they want to put in place, nothing has been as effective as a graduated licence, nothing.
You're also campaigning for something called Harvey's Hammer as well. I mean, the part of your story that is so brutally painful is the fact that they crashed, but then tragically they died because of drowning. Yeah,
I mean, ultimately, I believe my son shouldn't have been able to get in that car because they're children at the end of the day. It's 17, 18, they're a child, and they shouldn't be in charge of a lethal weapon, you know, and responsible for other people's lives at such a risky period of their driving, like, you know, their driving experience. So that's my ultimate aim. However, the reason some of the road deaths have come down in young people is because of safer cars, and with that came, obviously, tougher glass windows that can't be put down in window and stuff. So in my eyes, when they did all these new safety laws, this should have just been mandatory in every car. You know, it's like having a life jacket on a boat. You don't ever expect to use it.
So if you get trapped in the car and you can't get out, there is a hammer that will smash the glass so you can...
In seconds,
evacuate if you need
and it would, I mean, it's rare that these, obviously, things are as tragic as what happened with Harvey and the boys, but in them situations, this is a matter of life and death, and they cost a few pounds, you know, it's not a big thing. It's,
So this is the second petition you're taking to Downing Street. Where are you with it, Crystal, and what do you think is going to happen?
Well, it's just frustration all the way, really. We've got over 100,000 signatures on this petition. We actually had a parliamentary debate with over 30 MPs turned up. Only 2 were sort of against it. You know, everybody else was urging the government, saying this is long overdue. We've got the RAC backing it, the AA backing it. There was 99 organisations signed the PACS manifesto, which included graduated licences. We've got every behavioural psychologist in the country urging the government to do this. We've got decades' worth of research and evidence, and we are just at an absolute loss at why this is not being put in place.
Have you managed to speak to the Transport Secretary?
I've had a meeting with the Roads Minister, with the previous Roads Minister and this Roads Minister, and we were hopeful that this government were going to do more, but we're still waiting on the road safety strategy. And they keep saying, like I say, that they're going to look at root causes. And I think anybody, again, who questions this law should just spend some time looking into brain development of young people. you know, telling a teenager is not always enough. You know, when people say, oh, educate your kids, nobody ever expects it to be them. You know, no parent ever expects it to be their child. And with Harvey, I mean, this generally was the last thing on my mind at the time. You know, he was just turned 17. We had, as far as we knew, had not a single friend who'd passed a test. You know, he only had one friend who was taking some lessons. You know, we never, ever expected him to have a friend who was drove and for this to happen. Yeah.
Well, Crystal, thank you for coming in and sharing your story. Best of luck with the petition, and hopefully you get something back from the government. Regardless, at least it gives you somewhere to go, because it is really apparent. And I know that my kids have both passed their driving tests. We just want to keep them safe.
Yeah.
And if you don't want anyone to go through what you've all been through.
That's the thing. There's nothing more restrictive than death. And my son has lost his life, as many others. And I think when people realise that, like, 95 people every week are killed or seriously injured as a result of a young driver, and they hold less percentage of driving licences, they drive less miles than any other age group, that's a huge number.
Yes.
And, you know, when you know that there's a solution just there, ready, that would work, it's madness. It's madness that this has not been put in place.
Thank you for coming in
today,
Crystal.
Thank you so much.
Oh, hello. Thank you for visiting our This Morning YouTube channel. We upload tons of new content every single day. So hit the subscribe button, like all the videos, and don't miss out. We'll see you in the morning.